Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our discussion with Professor Khaled Abou Fadl on Gaza and the problem of political tyranny in the Islamic world. Yesterday, we had a wonderful conversation with Khaled and Peter Beinart, a Muslim-Jewish dialogue on the question of religious ethics in dark times. It's a huge personal honor for me to have Khaled here on campus for the entire week. He has several talks set up. I consider him to be, and I frequently refer to him as the leading Muslim ethicist of our age. For those of you unfamiliar with his work, I encourage you to familiarize yourself with his work. I will give him a proper introduction in a moment. But here at Georgetown, we have something called the free speech policy, where we're obligated to read out before we begin any event. In the extreme case that there is some sort of disruption and we have to call in a higher authority, everyone will know what their legal rights are. So I'm going to ask Jonathan to read out that statement. So we had a series of events planned this week with Professor Abou Fadl. Tomorrow night, he was supposed to give an informal talk to Muslim students at our mosque on campus. And then he was invited by our imam here on campus to give the Jummah khutbah, the Friday prayer sermon. I just checked my email recently, and to my shock, surprise, and horror, I found out that those invitations were revoked. I haven't had a chance to speak with the imam yet to try and get a further explanation for why these invitations at the last minute, literally at the 11th hour, were revoked. But as soon as I get more information, I will share it with everyone. But I want everyone to know that given our firm commitment to freedom of speech, freedom of expression, especially at this moment when it's under assault here in the United States, we are going to still organize tomorrow evening's talk after a Maghrib prayer, but it'll happen in this room, not in the mosque where it was supposed to happen. So I just wanted to bring that to everyone's attention. There will be, I think, somewhat of a poster or an announcement for tomorrow night's talk that will be circulated, right, Jonathan?
Yes.
Yeah, so we'll have more information. We'll put it on our website, I guess, yes. Right? So people can find out. So check our website for specific details, but there will be an informal discussion. It's for Muslim students, but of course here at Georgetown, we don't exclude anyone. Muslim, non-Muslim, 1 foot in Islam, 1 foot out of Islam, just widely interested in it, you're welcome to the discussion tomorrow evening. And then so that's an update on Khaled's schedule for this week. So officially, in terms of his official biography, Khaled Abou Fadl's area of specialization is in the field of Islamic law and human rights. He is the Omar and Azmeralda Alfi Distinguished Professor of Law at the UCLA School of Law, where he teaches courses on international human rights, Islamic jurisprudence, political asylum and refugee law, Muslims, race, and the law, and many other topics. He was formerly the chair of Islamic studies at UCLA, and he's the founder of the Institute of Advanced Usuli Studies, a nonprofit educational institute dedicated to ethics, beauty, and critical thinking in the Islamic tradition. I encourage you to look at their website. Khaled has received numerous awards over the years, including the distinguished Martin Marty Award for the public understanding of religion from the American Academy of Religion. It's a huge honor to have him here this week. Please join me in welcoming Khaled Abou Fadl to Georgetown. So by way of introduction to this topic, this is day 572 of the Gaza genocide. Yesterday, Amnesty International released a statement that read, quote, "Israel is perpetrating a live-streamed genocide in Gaza, committing illegal acts with the specific intent of wiping out Palestinians. Israeli forces in Gaza have violated the UN Genocide Convention with acts that include causing serious bodily or mental harm to civilians and deliberately inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about their physical destruction," Amnesty International said in its annual report. I think that statement accurately summarizes what you all know or should know is happening in Gaza today. because we often talk about Gaza in abstract terms, quoting statements, citing numbers, I wanted to set the tone and the mood for today's discussion on Gaza and the problem of political tyranny by showing a brief 1-minute drone footage from Gaza that gives you a sense of exactly what's happening there today and why this topic is so urgent from a political perspective, a moral perspective, an ethical perspective. So Jonathan, could you show us that video?
When I wanted to get out there, I found you. You gave me this.
Should I turn this off?
Yeah, turn it off. Actually, I think it's this one. You can see it better. So the topic of Gaza has received obviously a lot of attention since October the 7th. What has received very little attention is the relationship between this genocide in Gaza and the problem of political authoritarianism in the Arab and Islamic world. We've heard a lot about what Israel has said and is doing in Gaza. We've heard a lot about what the United States has said and is supporting in Gaza. We've heard a lot about what Europe and other countries have said and are doing in Gaza. What we've heard very little about, and where there's a big gap, I think, in terms of our analysis and understanding, is what's happening within the Arab and Islamic world with respect to the question of the genocide in Gaza, and to what extent can one make an argument that existing Arab states and Muslim states and political leaders are complicit in the horrors of this genocide in Gaza. So Khaled and I are going to have a conversation. He's going to do most of the talking. I'm going to pose questions. After some time, we'll turn it over to the audience. But I want to pose one big sort of broad question at the outset and ask Khaled to sort of give a big, broad, and as long of an answer as you want. What is the relationship, Khaled, between the genocide in Gaza and the question of dictatorship or authoritarianism in the Arab world? Could you lay out a broad argument? Because for most people, I think it's not self-evident.
Well, first, thank you, Nader. And in a previous life, I used to be an attorney working for a law firm here in D.C. I don't know, probably the law firm's still around, called Kirkpatrick and Lockhart. I used to do securities law, stocks and stuff like that. So DC is weirdly home in a very strange, odd way. And I can't resist the temptation. Unfortunately, and maybe this is a good segue and beginning. Unfortunately, I am too accustomed, too well acquainted, too well adapted to the type of trauma that comes from fellow Muslims censoring you and blacklisting you. And I don't beat around the bush about it. This is core to the plight of Muslims in the modern age. I've written and spoken a lot about, and I have a book that was published recently called The Palestine Sermons, and I encourage you to look at this book because you'll find a lot of the thought encapsulated there. The fear and cowardliness. It's as if it is fed to Muslims in their mother's milk, and we all grow up with the generational trauma of associating politics with a world of trouble, with a world of fear. And there is no, and this now is from the human rights perspective. As a professor of international human rights law, I teach and have taught international human rights law for a very long time. I cannot point to a single human atrocity or major atrocity in modern human history that was not coupled with the corruption of language. Corruption of language is and the despotic attempt to define narrative in very distinct way always goes side by side, hand by hand, with major human rights violations. Recently, I was reading about a well-known human atrocity that takes place in World War II, where about 12,000 Poles were murdered. Most of them were intellectuals, officers in the Polish army, and for 50 years, we had two competing narratives. The Russians or the Soviets saying that the Nazis murdered these 12,000 Poles in a major genocide, and the Nazis denying that they committed the genocide and blaming the Soviets. And after 50 years, only when space for language and the space for narrative opened up was it clearly established who was responsible for this major massacre, and it was the Soviets. But it is remarkable the distortions of history and how it would not have been, that type of distortion would not have been possible but for the instrumentalities of tyranny that controlled narrative and control the sources and venues to knowledge. I actually want to start by sharing, this is a book that I would recommend reading. It's actually quite good, by Didier Fassin. Didier Fassin is a French intellectual. He's an anthropologist, sociologist. I think he's even a physician. One of these people who, but I want to share some language from his book with you, and then go from there. Start out the language with a poem by the Palestinian poet Fadi Jouda, where he says, "From time to time, language dies. It is dying now. Who is alive to speak it?" This is Fadi Jouda's poetry. Now, Hassan says, and I'm going to quote two parts of his book. We're sort of commenting on this poem. He says, language is damaged when demands to stop killing civilians are anti-Semitic. When an army that dehumanizes its enemies is moral. When an enterprise of obliteration is a repository. When a military operation openly conducted against Palestinian civilians is the Israel-Hamas war. Thinking is suffocated when debates are prevented, lectures banned, and exhibitions canceled, when the police enter institutions of higher education and prosecutors are imposed to ensure orthodoxy. Well, the big irony is that nowhere is this more true than in Muslim lands. You cannot speak without debates prevented, lectures banned, exhibitions canceled, police entering institutions of higher education, and prosecutors imposing orthodoxy. That is nowhere more true than Egypt, than Jordan, than Saudi Arabia, than the United Arab Emirates, than Morocco, to the extent that just simply holding the Palestinian flag, showing the Palestinian flag in Egypt is an offense, and you will be arrested. I have friends who actually been arrested because he raised the Palestinian flag in Tahrir, and another friend who did it in a soccer game. The narrative that, now imagine with me, reflect on the fact 2 billion Muslims standing by, absolutely unable to effect a genocide. I don't know if any of you have looked at the record compiled by South Africa in the ICJ case, but it is remarkable that a country like South Africa that systematically does the diligent work of compiling an overwhelming record demonstrating genocidal intent, which is necessary under the Genocide Convention for proving the crime of genocide. And what South African lawyers simply did is that they compiled an enormous corpus of announcements, pronunciations by the Israeli military and Israeli politicians saying, we will exterminate these people. These people are subhuman, these people are animals, these people are Amalekites, these people are so on and so forth. Now, you consider why being involved, and I know quite a few attorneys, being even involved, attorneys from Egypt or Jordan or Saudi Arabia or the Emirat, even being involved in working with the South African legal team in bringing this case before the International Court of Justice, put them at risk. So I've got several lawyers who were told explicitly by the authoritarian state in Egypt, by the authoritarian state of Morocco, you are not allowed to participate or cooperate or work with. So here's the thing, and this is really are Muslims complicit in the genocide? Absolutely yes. There's no way that you can beat around the fact that the Egyptian military have profited handsomely from this genocide. There is no way around the fact that the Egyptian military, and I've got, it's actually a friend of mine who brought a patient from Gaza who was injured by an Israeli bombardment. Her leg was completely messed up and she needed, Cheyenne's sister, who's a doctor, helped bring that patient from Gaza to be treated here in the United States. And when you sit and talk to her about the way she was treated by the Egyptian military, she describes the treatment by the Egyptian military as worse than the way she's been treated by the Americans and Israelis. And that doesn't surprise me. It doesn't surprise me because you've got a dynamic where the Egyptian military charges from $5,000 to $10,000 Gazans who want to escape because they have. So you've got a military that profits from a genocide. Now, that is impossible but for tyranny. That is impossible but for the corruption of language. Because you need the twisting and distortion of narrative and language
for somehow that to be acceptable as if an economic opportunity for Egypt. And that's just the surface, by the way, because there are many other signs of absolute corruption, including stealing aid headed for Gaza and selling it on the black market. I mean, we've got a huge record of testimony and documents. When I say we, I mean Human Rights Watch, who I've worked with for 40 years. It's mind-numbing. The amount of trade that increased since the genocide was Morocco. The amount of trade that escalated since the genocide was the United Arab Emirates. The amount of trade that increased and the enabling of the genocide that Jordan engages in. The only way this would be possible is through tyrannical governments that do not allow this type of narrative. And look at how deep tyranny is. I have absolutely no doubt. When Nader told me, oh, you're going to speak to Muslim students after Maghrib and you're going to give the khutbah. My experience with Muslims, I expected cancellation. I was just waiting for the call to come and say, no, sorry, because of what I said yesterday. Because one of the reasons that in my career, I mean, the amount of times that I've been blacklisted by Muslims, and it's not because I am saying anything particularly brilliant or original. I'm just saying what is obvious. The human rights record in Muslim countries suck. Any person that works in the field of human rights knows what happens in Emirati prisons. We just have had the brutalizations of Qaradawi's son. I don't know how many of you have heard of it. And the complete inability to even prevent or hold a country like the Emirat that is supposed to be the cosmopolitan center of the Middle East, blah, 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 and the Abrahamic Accords and all that rhetoric, and corruption of language, because the Abrahamic Accords themselves is corruption of language. We are not even sure if Qaradawi's son is still alive. I mean, we know that he was admitted in a very bad shape to a hospital, and there were efforts to save his life, but then information was severed for all human rights activists that have pursued this case. But this is classic. But there's another, this is a point that Peter Beinhart raises in his book, and anyone that works in the human rights field encounters it time and time again. When it comes to you encounter it among politicians, you encounter it among State Department officials, you encounter it even this conviction that, well, if Muslims and Arabs brutalize each other, then how can Israel ever be safe if it gives what Israeli politicians have described as subhuman animals equal rights or political rights because they're barbarians? And that type, again, of twisting and corruption of language in a paradigm in which despotism lends itself to genocidal behavior, because you cannot commit a genocide without first convincing the world that to detach emotionally, morally, ethically from those that you are obliterating. A genocide is impossible without dehumanization. And what it takes, a great deal of authoritarianism, despotism is needed to dehumanize enough to commit massacres and not raise the conscience of the world. Look at the massacre, the genocide that was committed in Yemen and continues to be committed in Yemen by Saudis. Look at the amount, how many of us truly think of the Yemenis that lost their life, that continue to lose their life, as fully human, or fully human equal even to an Israeli. I would submit to you that that affects your psychology, who you see as someone that you can connect with, you can associate with, you can feel that they're very much fully human as much as you are, with a full narrative of emotions and story and events and family and social connections. The more distant, and genocidal studies is a very advanced field. Now we know a great deal about the dehumanization that is needed. And again, I'll close with this, is that essential to the dynamics of dehumanization is the control of language. You control language first, and after you control language, you obliterate.
Khaled, let me draw you out a bit further and make the argument that the problem is much deeper than the controlling language. And so let me advance a provocative argument. It's really not that provocative if you think about it, but I think for many people in this room, at first glance, it might seem provocative. And so the question is this, why are there no protests today against the genocide in Gaza in front of the Egyptian embassy? Why the Egyptian embassy? What does that have to do with the genocide in Gaza? Well, hello, there's a long border that Egypt shares with Gaza. On the other side of that border, there's a genocide happening. Since March the 2nd, it's been under a total blockade. No food, no medical supplies, no fuel. What is preventing the Egyptian army from opening that border and stopping a genocide? But the question for you is this. It's not the political question of what's happening in Cairo. It's the question of why don't Muslims even think along these lines? It's pretty clear if you just look at the objective facts in Gaza, you look at a map, you look at the genocide, you'll say, well, you know what? If there was a pressure point that could be applied, that could sort of maybe change this equation, put pressure on Egypt to open that border. Or on a related point, I mean, there's many other examples that I can think, but the question that I want to pose to you is that there seems to be a cognitive gap here when we think about what's happening in Gaza. Arab countries can't do anything.
No.
I mean, this is they can't do anything to stop this. Well, guess what? Donald Trump is going to the Middle East next month, and he's going to be going to Saudi Arabia, and all of these countries are announcing big investments in the United States. How difficult would it be? Or think about it this way, how transformative it might be if the king of Saudi Arabia or his, infamous son were to simply say, hypothetically in an alternative world, we're canceling the visit by the US president until this genocide stops. It would be transformative. But when it comes to having these types of arguments in the community of Muslims, that option, these arguments, which sound pretty accessible and non-controversial in my view, for I think many people that I engage with, at least in the community of Muslims, it's like you're having a conversation with someone from a different planetary system. So am I exaggerating?
No, I don't think
So
you
the question is, what's the problem here? How do we get to the root of it?
The answer is, I think, is Allahu Alam, God knows best, but it is complicated. My experience in the human rights field has convinced me that for the despots of the Middle East, for the despots of the Arab world in particular, their constituency, their public is hardly human. I'm thoroughly convinced that the proxies for the foreign willpower, the militaries of the Middle East, would exterminate their own people without a second thought. We already saw that with the Egyptian army in Rabaa and the way they
In order to stay in power, to
in
survive.
order, and in order even to serve goodwill, to remain in the goodwill graces of a country like the United States, or to earn bonus points with the Israelis. I don't think that it's like a comment you often hear in Egypt. Egypt is not a people with an army, it's an army that happens to have a people. So Egypt is about the army, and then the people are there just to serve the interests of the army. You know, so and I think that you can extend this to pretty much everywhere. There are no Saudi people. There are no Jordanian people. It's the oligarchic system of power, the security apparatus, and then the people are basically superfluous. And so, why is this important? Because so now, why is it? Because your question is, why is it that Muslims that find themselves, we all know that Muslims in Egypt or Arabs or in Jordan, or they will not protest because they know what will happen. I mean, they go behind the sun, as they say, or a shams, and the horror stories that everyone who's had a relative or a friend arrested knows the absolute hell that these people go through, and that chilling effect of that hell. And then you have a bizarre world where the president of the United States openly endorses an idea that is a crime against humanity under the Geneva Conventions and under the Genocide Convention, the displacement of an entire population, and will espouse that idea, and not a single representative of the Arab world says, how dare you endorse a crime against humanity that gives universal jurisdiction to any country to, in fact, try you for just simply supporting this idea. And they actually negotiated, well, we need to talk about it. And you heard the King of Jordan. I mean, a profound embarrassment. And the solution is something that we're all accustomed to, is the response to the sense of absolute disempowerment and embarrassment is repression. It's to turn around and say, well, you know who's really the problem in the circumstance? It's the Muslim Brotherhood. And we need to take, and Muslim Brotherhood to become the typical boogeyman that's hiding under the bed. It's just so old and overdone and redundant. It's truly boring. But then you come to Muslims who are actually in the West. And I think anecdotal stories are very helpful in bringing complex ideas closer to mind. So one of the supposed more open-minded Muslim institutions in the United States is an institution that I have been associated with for a long time, the Islamic Center of Southern California. And I don't know if any of you know this already, but I was banned from the Islamic Center of Southern. I used to give the khutbahs there and Jummah, and then I was banned from the Islamic Center of Southern California because I criticized Sisi. And
General El-Sisi, for people who don't know.
Sisi of Egypt.
Yeah.
And when you come and you think an institution, a Muslim institution that prides itself on being liberal, open-minded, non-patriarchal, embodying American values of freedom of speech and equal protection of law. But that's all the stuff that they claim to. But yet, when it came to Middle Eastern politics, the leadership, which of course happened to be Egyptian, what is that impels them to self-censor, to censor one another? And this is where you see the extent to which I think despotism has become a part of our cultural thinking, part of our generational legacy. It's the same reason that you had an imam that canceled the events after hearing the conversation. It is, I think, very informative. Peter's reaction to that conversation is he wrote me a message saying, "You remind me of Rabbi Herzl, the greatest ethicist of the Jewish tradition."
That's a huge honor. That's a huge honor.
It is, and I took it as such.
Yeah.
But the response of Muslims in institutional positions of power is fear. And I'm convinced that ultimately, when all is said, and when you say fear of what, what is it that you, and it is a great deal of cultural gap in knowledge. Because you feel disempowered because you don't feel that you know the society that you live in. You don't know the law. You don't feel that you have possession over the Constitution. The Constitution, you don't feel is part of your very being. You don't feel familiar and comfortable with the legal system enough to say, I have rights and I'm going to assert these rights. You fully feel alien. And you feel Islam is an alien phenomena to the society, and you are part of that alien phenomena. And because you're so alien, the only way to remain safe is to, as the Arabic expression goes, you walk next to the wall. All Arabs are raised. Definitely I was, and all my family, my cousins and my we're all raised with our mothers telling us, when it comes to politics, walk next to the wall. Politics is scary. Avoid politics at all costs. Even if you get the green light from the ruler to say something, like, for instance, supporting Camp David, it's better because you don't know, the ruler might change their mind tomorrow and then you'll be in trouble. So just avoid the topic. We're raised with this. Do we undergo a transformation when we come to the United States, when we immigrate to the United States? I don't think so.
So in this example of the mosque in Southern California, where you were banned from speaking because you criticized the dictatorship in Egypt, it wasn't that the Egyptian embassy was calling that mosque and pressuring them. It was the leadership of that mosque, coming from the Arab and Islamic world, had a certain sort of instinctive sort of reaction that when we have a sermon that's political and that's criticizing, authoritarianism, our natural instinct is to just try and silence that.
It is actually sort of shamefully and embarrassingly trivial, because I know the culture enough to know that what goes through their mind, what if we can't go to Egypt in the summer? And I, go to Egypt in the summer and buy gifts for my cousins and I don't know what. And it's really cool when then I go to Sharm el-Sheikh and spend time and, vacationing on the beach. And, that's when I feel I'm really cool because I'm an immigrant from the United States and everyone is impressed when, because I'm the American cousin. And and all of that is endangered. And because if it happens to be that someone from the Egyptian embassy hears about this khutbah, and then, that will ruin my coolness in the summer. But that is what authoritarianism teaches you. It teaches you the idea that sacrifice itself. It's like you expect freedom to be given to you as a gift. And the idea that your rights are not given as a gift. You must demand your rights. And no one will give you your rights unless there is a reason to give you your rights. That type of thinking that I said this yesterday, but I'll repeat it. One of, it is not, I think Muslims as immigrants can learn a great deal from Jewish culture in the West because they've had experience with oppression and disempowerment for a far longer period than Muslims in the West. And I always admire that among when I teach courses like I teach a course called Political Crimes. We look at political crimes in history and the response of legal systems. I teach a course on American legal history. It is not an accident that repeatedly my best students, time and time again, are Jewish students. And I admire their sense of, I know what my rights are, and I owe it to myself and my people to be the best and to contribute to the world. Not just contribute to being Jewish, but contribute to, and that means that excellence is what I expect of myself, and matter of rights, it is my obligation to demand rights. Now, my experience with Muslim students in law school is that they're timid. I've even when they are doxxed, even when the dean has invited Muslim students to come meet with him to discuss doxing incidents and so on. If I would describe to you the amount of timidness, number one, no Muslim males showed up. The only Muslim law students that showed up were women. Very instant. Muslim men are cowardly. Muslim women are far braver. That's a fact. So, but even the women who showed, every single student told me a story about how they're getting pressure from their family not to create waves, not to create problems, not to make demands. You have to worry about your career, and it's embedded in the culture. Tyranny and authoritarianism is embedded in the generational trauma that we pass on to our children.
Look, there's so many questions that I have that I want to ask of you, but we have a patient audience here. And because two of your presentations that were supposed to happen have been sort of unceremoniously terminated, I want to give the audience maximum time to ask you questions.
Sure.
But I just want to make one observation that you made earlier on that struck me as very important in relationship to this topic, the problem of political tyranny in Gaza. So you mentioned the really sort of heroic moment that happened roughly a year ago when South Africa led this international team at The Hague to hold Israel accountable for violating the UN Genocide Convention. And one of the issues that came up was, well, why did South Africa take the lead? There's a lot of Muslim countries. There's the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. There's the Arab League. You could have hired a legal team. You could have pursued this. Why were they completely absent? And there's many answers to that question, but I think the fundamental answer as to why South Africa took the lead and why no Arab or Muslim state took the lead is because at the core of the International Court of Justice trial that Israel now has to sort of answer for, and that South Africa led the way for, is the principle of accountability for human rights violations. And the core of despotism, the core of authoritarianism is non-accountability. I mean, accountability is actually the principal goal of authoritarianism. And so that's why there was no Arab or Muslim representation. And fundamentally, it's not a coincidence that it's a South Africa that's democratic, that's representative, a lot of problems, that was able to lead this charge and inspire the world.
This might be, again, a very informative moment. when the U.S. recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital and moved the embassy,
Mhm.
I think I thought it was very informative that I have relatives and friends who are prominent writers, without naming names so they don't get in trouble, in Egypt. They got phone calls from Egyptian intelligence
Mhm.
telling them there will be an announcement of moving the embassy
Mhm.
to Jerusalem. And here's what we want you to say. Here's what is going to be what you, as a writer, as an intellectual, you're going to be invited to appear on TV. You're going to be interviewed.
Mhm.
Here's what you are going to say. And this didn't happen just with writers and journalists.
Mhm.
It also happened with shuyukh,
Mhm.
and it also happened with actors and actresses.
Yeah.
There was an embarrassing moment when one of these calls was leaked. It was to a well-known Egyptian actress called Yusra.
Mhm.
Those of you who watch Egyptian garbage know who she is. I mean, only in Egypt would Yusra be impressive, by the way, because she has no talent. I don't know her personally, so there's nothing personal. She's garbage. But anyway, so it was leaked.
Yeah.
But I know journalists who was just like, well, they appeared on, they got the invitation, and they all sounded like one another.
Yeah.
But their script was dictated.
Yeah.
And I remember once upon a time when I was often in the old days don't do as much of it now because for obvious reasons under the Trump administration, but we would constantly meet with State Department officials about human rights issues.
Mhm.
But I remember just from conversation with State Department officials, they would always say, oh, if we ever recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital, there will be an uproar in the Muslim world. There's going to be wars. And I would remember always thinking, I didn't tell them that, but I would always think to myself, God, you're deluded.
Mhm.
You have no idea how cowardly these dictators are.
Yeah.
A war might mean they would lose their throne.
Yeah.
And they will never risk a war with a real army.
Yeah.
All they want is to use their military against their unarmed people.
Mhm.
That's the extent
Yeah.
of their aspirations and dreams.
Yeah.
And as happened 10 years later, when the United States did move the embassy, exactly what I expected happened.
Mhm.
Absolutely nothing.
And to bring it back to Gaza, one reason why I think this genocide has been proceeding is because there are literally no consequences for Israel to recalculate. All of the Arab countries that it has diplomatic relations with, none of them have broke relations. And as you mentioned, many of them have increased economic ties behind the scenes.
I mean, it's really scary when you hear Israeli politicians say, privately, they actually encourage us to continue. And that's there's something in you that says, I don't want to believe that, but there's also something in you that says, they're saying the truth.
Yeah, there's an entire thesis that we could explore if there's time as to why the Arab leaders are so ideologically and politically devoted to supporting Israel's genocide in Gaza. I think there's questions of politics and political power that we need to sort of unpack. But let's turn the floor open to the audience. I see 1, 2, and the third hand there, and then we'll go over to this side of the room. Go ahead, sir.
Okay. We've had revolutions in the Islamic world against this authoritarianism. We had the revolution in Iran. We had the Arab Spring. Could we be on the brink of other revolutions?
I mean, I don't know. Maybe I'm jaded. I mean, the Iranian Revolution and the way that it was hijacked by the authoritarian ayatollahs the amount of potential that was lost. But same with the Egyptian revolution. But the Egyptian revolution, I agree with those who, because I was of that school from the very beginning, we thought in Majlis al-Askari, the military was playing a game, and the coup was inevitable, and they were just biding their time, and it was clear that this is the angle that where I mean, I have a lot of stories to tell. The Egyptian Supreme Court and the way that the Egyptian Supreme Court kept negating elections, one election after another, and in basically helping the military move things towards a coup. It's difficult for me to imagine right now, or at least in my lifetime, another democratic thrust. I mean, just how systematically the industry of fear and how efficient and effective it is makes me not optimistic.
The other element to that answer is that we're in the age of global authoritarianism, right?
Yeah.
Dictators in our part of the world are saying, well, look, if Donald Trump is disappearing students off the street and getting away, why can't we do it?
I mean, people. I don't know a lot of people. Don't. A lot of people don't realize the amount of sacrifices and work that went into creating the momentum for an international criminal court,
Mhm.
and actually establishing and defining the Rome Statute, the statute of the court.
Mhm.
And there were entire careers that were basically dedicated to that. But the United States, in passing the so-called Hague Invasion Act, basically saying that if I don't know if you guys know about this act. The Hague Invasion Act is that it's an act that Congress passed that said if the court in The Hague, the International Criminal Court, ever detains an American military personnel, the U.S. will invade the Netherlands to liberate. And so it's a very bad joke, but it's devastating for the field of human rights.
Yeah.
And the way that the United States has treated, particularly the United States, has treated the International Criminal Court since its creation,
Mhm.
even under the Obama administration, is undermining and undoing an entire dream and momentum since the Nuremberg trials. And the sort of the idea that we live in a world where people do not commit things like sexual assaults, like with impunity, or because until the International Criminal Court, actually, we had no precedents where people were prosecuted for sexual assaults in war, and we only get this precedent because of the momentum of the International Criminal Court. So the undoing of that, the repercussions, is part of what Nader is talking about. This triumph of authoritarianism globally. Will there be a shift? The thing that is that I see how broken-hearted, I would put it this way. My law students are when they take international human rights, and how frustrated the idea that we cannot allow our world to slip back to a pre-World War II, pre-Nuremberg trials world where basically you get to act with impunity and no consequences. Will that frustration lead to an actual results, it's difficult for me to imagine, but also maybe because I'm approaching retirement age, and when at least personally, I don't know how about you guys, but when you approach retirement age, you get sort of more pessimistic and more grumpy, definitely. So grumpiness has been gone hand in hand with old age for me. So
Okay,
yeah.
thanks. Next question.
I have a smaller question about revolutions. In
Yeah.
2011 in the Arab Springs, we saw protesters challenging and overcoming state repression. Why didn't that replicate in the Gaza genocide?
That's a good question. So why didn't people in the Arab world rise up and confront their authoritarian regimes to protest the Gaza genocide? Well, they did do it in 2011. That's the question.
You know, Marwan Barghouti says he believes that every atrocity in Palestine will eventually have the type of repercussions that you're describing. And he presented this, an interesting historical analysis to bolster that point. Why it didn't, I can tell you that the what I describe as the terror industry is so effective, and it just happened that the terror industry rehabilitated itself after the Arab Spring, because the Arab Spring was a real shock.
What do you mean by the terror industry?
The terror industry is just the sending the systematic, consistent message to people that if you speak up in a space in which you were not, in fact, not just allowed to speak up, but in which your speech has not been defined for you,
Yeah.
there will be consequences that you can't predict. And I've seen this with with Moroccans, I've seen this with Jordanians, I've seen this with Egyptians. That sense that, well, we tried in the Arab Spring, and look where it got us, and look and even the sense of the theology of the return of the theology of authoritarianism as God's will, which we see among Muslims in the Arab world, and we see among Muslims even in the United States. And even Muslim institutions in the United States, which famously said Trump is part of God's will, and pious Muslims must accept Trump and accept the Muslim ban as just part of what God wants. And if you disobey Trump, you're disobeying God, which is, it reminds me a lot of when Azhari Shuyukh said, Sheikh Napoleon, obey Sheikh Napoleon, because if you disobey Napoleon, you're disobeying God.
Yeah.
It seems like we're locked into these circles of despotism that, and it's so comical, and it's I can't say, out of respect for the number of people that I know that have been arrested and disappeared, because I know I can sit and I can produce off the top of my head a list of at least 30 people in Egypt alone, because in response to Gaza, they've tried to speak out and they were arrested.
Yeah.
And some of them we know where they are. Some of them till now we don't even know where they're held.
Yeah. And so it's much worse under Sisi than it was under Mubarak.
Oh,
Yeah.
absolutely.
On the question of Palestine.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So that's the answer to the question. The level of repression.
Absolutely.
At the back, you had your hand up. Go ahead.
Thank you. I was wondering if there are any merits to people, living in Jordan or living in Egypt. In Islamic law, is there any framework that gives more, interest in safety versus repression? So if there is safety in a government repression, what would Islamic law say? Does that take precedence over justice?
I wrote an entire book called Rebellion in Islamic Law. This book in itself is published by Cambridge. It's a very dense book. It's very boring, very legalistic, but it's very interesting because there have been repeated efforts, by the way, to translate this book into Arabic, and every time it gets banned. Although it is all classical jurisprudence. This is not my opinions. I mean, it's a dense Cambridge book which talks about the opinions of every jurist that you've ever heard of in the Islamic tradition. And my answer is that the despotic tradition is well represented. The despotic tradition meaning the tradition that says, fitna is always dangerous and we must avoid, fitna is basically civil discord, or we must always avoid it at all price. And, a despot is always better than anarchy, and anarchy is the most dangerous thing. It's very well represented. But what is also very well represented in the Islamic tradition, where you might describe it as a tradition of Al-Hussein bin Ali, that you have an absolute duty to oppose a despot, and if you rebel against a despot and you are tortured or you're killed, your reward is with Allah, but you have an obligation to, and it is, and Muslim jurists try to negotiate these two poles, these two binaries, in very fascinating and sometimes very legalistic ways. Like, this would be a perfect example for the legalistic ways. They would start out by saying in a fatwa, such and such rebel, rebelled against the ruler, and rebellion is a very serious matter, and it's causes fitna, and there's anarchy, and then in anarchy all these bad things happen. But then by the end of the fatwa, it tells you that the legitimacy of the rebel, when all said and done, is equal to the legitimacy of the ruler. So that the ruler, it cannot be said that the rule of the ruler is God's will, nor is it, as a Shari'i matter, a legitimate government, because the ruler has committed their own share of offenses. So basically saying, as a jurist, I condemn the rebellion, but I also condemn the ruler, and let them fight it out, and whoever upholds the rule of law at the end, I will support. That was just like typical legalistic. But those who know Roman law and know the tradition of rebellion and common law are not surprised by that. The sort of the juristic way of saying, let's balance the evils and see what,
Mhm.
And so, but this is the thing. There is a tradition, and a lot of simple binaries. There is a tradition called Ahkam al-Bughat. Ahkam al-Bughat is a very nuanced and complex law of rebellion. And then there is the Ahkam al-Hiraba. And Ahkam al-Hiraba is basically what empowers you to call any rebel a terrorist. The modern state has completely suppressed Ahkam al-Bughat. So it is remarkable, but the Sheikh of Azhar or the Mufti will never talk about Ahkam al-Bughat. And the response they had to my book is because it's about Ahkam al-Bughat. But they will always use the Ahkam al-Hiraba to describe any opposition to the ruler and the Khawarij, and to say, any rebel, including the Ikhwan, are just Khawarij. I'm sure that the jurists, the fuqaha, know that both traditions exist, but they look the other way. I have a lot.
I think three more questions.
Yeah, I could just
at
go
the back,
on.
1, 2, and then 3, and then we'll move up here. Go ahead, you're first.
I'm curious your thoughts on Turkey. You didn't mention Turkey as a country among the other countries in the Middle East. What's your thoughts in terms of from a state perspective and also from a Turkish people perspective? Any leverage, any potential that either Turkish people might have to make the Gazans
I mean, I'm confused by Turkey. I'm confused by Turkey. I mean, there's no question that there is a very robust trade with Israel that continues on, and it wasn't affected by the genocide. And my Turkish colleagues and friends tell me that there is no chance that the Turkish people would force the government to respond to this genocide by reducing the trade, and that the politics of Turkey is too immoral to actually have the genocide affect trade. I don't want to believe it, so I choose to continue being confused. You know, if I know Turkey is a heartbreak for I mean any conscientious Muslim. Turkey is a heartbreak.
You had your hand up? Did you have your hand up?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Thank you so much for coming and speaking today. It's a huge honor to have you here at Georgetown.
Thank you for coming.
My question was about how you would respond to a Muslim country like Qatar, for example, where there isn't censorship regarding citizens and residents speaking out about the genocide, and waving the Palestinian flag is encouraged even. But the government would say they don't draw a harder line in the international arena because they don't want to burn bridges with other countries that maybe will open the door in the future for them hosting more like hostage negotiations or ceasefire deals. Like, do you think that that is also a cowardly position because they have the ability to draw a harder line and they don't? Or do you think that there's room there for?
I mean, you know, Qatar, yeah, that's another. Qatar always says, you know, our position is very precarious. We're under constant threat by the Emirates and Saudi. That the reconciliation with the Emirates and Saudi is quite superficial, and that they would love nothing more than to take Qatar down. And so they always present themselves as playing this delicate balancing. And it's very hard, I mean, but it's very difficult to take. I'll tell you something from the legal experience that's very telling. I mean, this is the first time I actually talk about this. I once handled a case. It was filed in England, and it was when the present Prince of Qatar overthrew his father. And I was retained by the British court as an expert witness to testify in the case. Because what happened was when the father was overthrown by his son, he took the entire wealth of Qatar, I mean, a crippling amount of wealth, and deposited it in England and the United States. And the son was suing in British courts and American courts, and me as an expert was testifying to British courts to decide the fate of the wealth. And I saw how in an instant, tyranny turns the fate of nations into a comedy. I mean, a real comedy. You had this whole country called Qatar. I can't tell you the amount of trillions of dollars that the father just with a stroke of a pen transferred in his name and put in American and British. And it is not the reason they wanted me to testify is because the son and the father sort of agreed. It was a very complicated arrangement, but to testify, and I was under a non-disclosure agreement for 20 years, so I couldn't speak about this for 20 years, and couldn't even tell this story. Now the disclosure agreement has expired, but speak of tyranny and what tyranny does. How many Qatari citizens do you think were even aware that their fate and the fate of their sons depended on the will of a British court that's going to decide what happens to all these billions of dollars? That's what makes me, when I hear Qatari officials talk about, balancing out, again, it's the corruption of language. It's I hear your words, but because you control narratives, I don't know what reality you're inviting me to embrace.
You had your hand up. Go ahead.
Thank you so much for your speech. I had two questions. One was about Turkey and then already asked. But I wanted to ask if you want to comment on any other part of non-Arab words, if there's any hope. But of course, I'm not asking you to go one by one.
Any hope for what exactly?
Like, could they do something like from Pakistan, for instance, or any other place in South Asia?
To stop the genocide in Gaza.
Yeah, sure. But then one more, comment/question, but very quickly. An example to, I think, a perversion of concepts and language. I think a pro-government Turkish newspaper recently wrote about how about hijrah for the Palestinians? How about if we cannot save them, if the Muslim world cannot do anything about them, could hijrah be their migration, but a voluntary migration, as if we cannot save they were asking, can we save? Is it important to save the Muslims or is it important to save the land? So they said, well, important to save the Muslims.
Yeah.
So maybe they were trying this trial balloon idea.
Yeah.
Could we do something about this?
Yeah.
And I thought this was a really good example of the perversion of concepts and language, to basically excuse the inability to do anything about it.
Netanyahu also uses the term voluntary migration, right? But the question you ask is actually a good one because it poses a moral dilemma here. Muslims in Gaza, most of them are Muslims, are facing a genocide. And so is it important to have them protect the land, or should we try and save their lives by getting them out of this horror show, knowing full well that if they leave, they're not coming back?
Yeah.
So how do you respond to that, Khaled?
I mean, listen, the hijrah, those who speak of hijrah, let's be very clear. The hijrah out of Mecca did not result in an abandonment of Mecca. It resulted in Muslims organizing themselves to wage war to conquer Mecca.
Yeah.
Now, if there is that type of hijrah for the Palestinians, if the Egyptians are going to open up the borders and help the Palestinians to build an army to liberate their land, then we can talk about hijrah.
Yeah.
But that's not what we're talking about.
Right.
We're talking about abandonment.
One-way trip.
And statelessness.
Yeah.
And let's be very clear, statelessness in our modern world is brutal. Statelessness in our modern world under the international order that we live in, and people don't know what statelessness is unless you go visit the detention centers in Louisiana and Texas and San Pedro. I used to have a lot of clients at San Pedro's, and I would have these poor Palestinian lifers. Basically, every year the service goes and says, "Is any country willing to take these Palestinians?"
Yeah.
Well, no country's willing to take them. Well, we're going to bribe you. The U.S. is willing to pay you some money to take them. Well, that's not enough money. No country will. Okay, so you remain in detention endlessly, forever. I had people who were in detention for 20 years. So statelessness is a world of agony and pain and ugliness. So what are you inviting the Palestinians to? either statelessness or death.
Yeah.
No.
It's a terrible choice. Yeah.
And the thing is, the reality is, if Egyptians take them, it's like what happened to the Rohingyas that the Saudis took.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, they treated them worse than animals.
Correct me if I'm wrong, it's almost from an Islamic ethical perspective offensive to call it hijra.
Yeah.
Because you're putting on you're sanitizing the process when we know
the
something
poor
very different.
Palestinian patient that Shahan's sister is treating, when she describes how the Egyptians treat her, it's unconscionable, and that's what the Palestinians have to look forward to if they end up in Egypt.
Yeah.
They're going to remain in concentration camps, and we forgotten Sabra and Shatila and the fate of Palestinian in refugee camps in Lebanon. I mean, these narratives repeatedly end up in absolute horrendous ugliness committed against the Palestinians.
So let's take 3 more questions, and we'll have them back to back so that we can, start to wrap up. So 1, 2, and then last one to Redwan. Go ahead.
Thank you. I was just like, if you could speak about like the sense by which, when like Arab countries comply with the policy, let's say, or the agenda of Israel, doesn't this also like create rather like this narrative that, Jews and Israel is in control of everything? Like for the population that, doesn't this like blame shift actually like, from the authoritarian regime of like the Arab countries rather like to blame just Israel?
Second question. Go ahead.
My question is about normalization with Israel, with Saudi Arabia. And I feel like when it comes to the state of the Saudi government, we know how despotic it is. We don't have to talk about it. But I feel like normalization has done a lot to Saudi posturing when it comes to public statements, when it comes to the way the MBS carries himself in public, having to make statements about Palestine and the Palestinians of Gaza. There is a lot of, let's say, thinking a lot about the language, the way they deliver themselves, not because of the way they want to present themselves to the international community, but also to their own people. And we also know that there's a lot of mechanisms in which they try to pursue and test people's reactions when it comes to normalization, even before October 7th. But the genocide in Gaza has completely, I would say, blown off like all these attempts by the government to try to introduce normalization to the people. You did talk about, how the whole region is more military and then people come second. But what would you say about this whole, again, posturing and Saudi Arabia being careful about how they deliver speech about Israel and what's
So
happening?
the question, in other words, correct for me, is to what extent does public opinion actually matter in authoritarian regimes? Because given the example of Saudi Arabia, they're testing the waters in terms of how far they can go with normalization with Israel, knowing it could blow up in their face. So,
if I may add, MBS said to Blinken, "My people will kill me." He actually used those words in case I normalize with Israel right now. So.
So that's the question. And the last question, Redwan.
Thank you, Dr. Khaled, for your courage and for an excellent lecture. I only disagree with one point you said, is it's your pessimism or your idea that we're not going to have another Arab Spring, the answer to the first question. I was in Tunisia when the Arab Spring started in December, I think, 17th. Nobody had an idea that we are in the beginning of a revolution. Nobody expected a revolution. And people were even a lot more scared of Ben Ali at that time than they are of Qais Said today. So I predict we're going to have another Arab Spring very soon. But nobody knows when, because it's like an earthquake. The scientists can tell you there is an earthquake is going to happen, in Los Angeles or San Francisco. They just cannot tell you when it's going to happen. But there's going to be another Arab Spring. That's for sure. And I think your role, and Nader's and mine and everybody in this room, is how can we make sure that the next Arab Spring is more successful than the previous one? We have to prepare. We have to prepare. We have to have a plan of action. We have to learn from our mistakes. And it's challenging because once it's happened, you can't control it.
So in other words, what are the lessons of the last Arab Spring that we can learn for the next
For the next one.
political opening that
Exactly.
will happen,
Exactly.
inshallah, soon. Yeah. Okay, so the first question, I wasn't 100% clear on what the first question is. Did you get it?
I mean, it's idea of, I mean, I'll answer it this way. Stupid people will adopt the bigoted, racist, stupid trope of, oh, the Jews are in control. I mean, what do you do about stupid, racist people? Does it aid the narrative? I mean, I don't think it is appeasing Israel as much as appeasing the superpower behind Israel. I think that's what they care about, the United States. You know, if it hadn't been for the love affair that the Emirati elite and the Saudi elite, well, I mean, particularly those that they have with the United States, and their belief that all the cards, which is something that Sadat used to say, repeated by Mubarak, something that I know that Sisi Complete believes of, that all the cards are in the hands of the United States, that the only country that really matters in the world is the United States. And that's in part because you're talking about leaders who are not very educated. I mean, let's be, and not very smart. You're talking about the bottom of the barrel. These guys that go to military school, you know, and it's well known in Egypt that you need 90 in the 90s to go to medical school or to go to engineering, and you need somewhere in the 50s or 60s to go to military school. So you have to be a bad student and a substandard intellectual to survive in military school. And actually, I mean, I have a friend who was right now to get in the military school in Egypt. You actually pay a bribe of about £1 million Egyptian pounds, and you need the wasta because all the privileges and that. So I had a friend who was, his father told him, because he was a sort of smart kid, said, skip a few questions on the exams to lower your grade, because if you have a higher grade point, you won't get accepted in military school because the officers will be threatened by you and, you know, saying we can't work with this guy. So you're talking about morons who are leading these countries. And so, I mean, the fact that they think, oh, it's very simple. The United States calls all the shot, and we live all in basically under a single empire, that the globe is controlled by the United States, and it doesn't surprise me. Yeah.
The question about public opinion.
Yeah. Remind me again.
Yeah, so the question is, to what extent does public opinion matter in an authoritarian regime? So if you take the case of MBS in Saudi Arabia, he wants to jump into bed with Netanyahu, but he knows that there would be, in the context of a genocide, there would be a societal revolt. So public opinion obviously does matter to some extent.
I mean, I don't think it does. I think that is the little glimmer. I actually, again, I'm sorry, but MBS, I know quite a few Saudis that went to school with this guy, and he was known as a bully and a moron from the time he was in school. He was, again, affirmatively not intelligent. This is not, you're not talking about and he's very threatened from the time he was in school. He was very threatened by intellectuals and absolutely hated people who read books. And people who know told me that he's, you know, where's Abdullah Al-Oud is not here, but I mean, he can tell you volumes about stuff like that. So my point is this, is that it's the little sign of some intelligence where he actually referred to his people as a leveraging power, which is something that you learn, that this is what about politics about. It's a little sign of some level of intelligence when he actually refers to his people as leverage. But does he really care about what his people? I don't think so. I mean, I really think he takes his people for granted. And this notion of the enlightened despot, nothing is new here. I mean, since colonialism, Every despot has sort of gone to bed with the colonizer, with the notion that I am enlightened. I'm going to prove to you that I am a reformer. And so you don't have to feel that bad in supporting me because, I'm not just brutalizing my people.
But is
So-
he a little afraid of his people?
Yeah. I mean, I think, well,
Does
is he
the public
afraid of his
opinion
people?
matter if he's afraid?
Well, I mean, despotism and oppression is always an expression of fear. I mean, but it is like the fact that, for instance, his close guards are not Saudi, right? I mean, and they're intentionally. That says that the fact that he still has every Saudi intellectual who's worth anything is locked up, and he doesn't dare think about releasing them. Yeah, it tells me he's maybe afraid of that his people will finally get fed up. Yeah.
So Radwan's question is, just to summarize it, because it's a good question, a forward-looking question. The authoritarian status quo is unsustainable. There's going to be another revolution. There's going to be a political opening. What are the lessons of the last Arab Spring that we need to learn in order to not make the same mistakes the next time there's a political opening in the region?
I mean, this is what scares me, because the greatest lesson is that there is no space to work with the military. And that's scary. I mean, because the military from the first day, I mean, and maybe the Egyptian experience is different than the Tunisian a bit, but the military from the very beginning said, whoever you elect, but let's be very clear, the military budget remains under the control of military, that there will not be transparency about military expenditures. There will not there will not be any type of civilian control over military affairs, and these were the rules of the game. And the elections were held, and in hope of avoiding a clash with the military, that was all agreed to. And as has been the long legacy since colonialism, the military sees itself as sort of the guardians of modernity, whatever that means to the military mind, right? And they are the safeguard against what they see as the self-suicidal tendencies of the Muslim masses, which is again a very typical colonial outlook. That these Muslims, if given space, they'll basically burn themselves. They'll destroy themselves with their lack of understanding and insight and so on, which is again very ironic because the military, the most ignorant part of society, is. I've had when the Egyptian Revolution happened, there were quite a few intellectuals like Khaled Fahmy and who gave up their entire career and went back to Egypt to try to build a new Egypt, and it didn't go well for the amount of Egyptians who resigned their academic posts in the U.S. To say they regret it is to put it mildly, because what happened to them was horrendous. I thank God that I didn't go crazy and resign my post, and because I was tempted to, we're going to build a new Egypt, and then I would be unemployed now, and probably my family would be homeless. But I sure hope you're right. I don't know. I sure hope our history with the militaries have always been a history of brutalization, and because they're ultimately the only hold themselves accountable to the foreigner, whether it's France, the U.S. It's probably primarily right now it's France and the U.S. are the two main players. I don't think England matters that much anymore. But
So on behalf of
I hope
the-
you're right. I really do.
I hope so too.
Yeah.
So Khaled, it's wonderful having you here. We look forward to having you back in this room tomorrow evening for a more informal discussion. Please join me in thanking.
Overcome censorship.